I'm back, and I'm wearing another sweater. If you have ever listened to jazz in your life, you've probably heard a chord progression that sounds like this. What I just played is a string of dominant seventh chords descending chromatically. E7, E flat 7, D7, D flat 7. It's something you hear in jazz and other styles sometimes, and it sounds good, it sounds logical, and our ears can understand it. But in the context of a song that's in some key, how do you justify this totally parallel harmonic movement? What's the theory behind it? This sort of chord progression is justified through a technique called tritone substitution. The tritone is a unique interval because it inverts to itself. If you take a tritone and move the lower pitch up an octave, the resulting interval is still a tritone. This unique property is a big component in tritone substitution, so keep it in mind. We're going to come back to it in a bit. There's a compositional tool that's really common in jazz and classical music called a falling fifth progression. So say we're in the key of A major. In the key of A, the 5-7 chord is E7. E7 wants to go to A major, the 1 chord. But suppose instead of going to plain A major, we go to A7. This is a kind of deceptive resolution. The chord resolves in the direction it's supposed to, but it arrives at another unsettled harmony. A7 is the 5-7 chord in the key of D major, so it wants to resolve to D, except we land on D7. Instead of G, that resolves to G7, etc. So what we have is a series of chords resolving down a fifth to another chord that wants to resolve down a fifth. We're basically swinging counterclockwise around the circle of fifths. This is what's called a falling fifth progression. It's usually used in a really unsettled section of a musical composition, and it's a vehicle for getting from one place to another. Eventually, we have to break the chain with a proper resolution. Maybe in this example, G7 will finally resolve to a regular C major chord, and we're good. So we just strung ourselves from E7 to C major. Directly, E7 is pretty unrelated to C major. They don't even come from the same key, but we took a logical route to get from one to the other. That's how falling fifth progressions work. Put a pin in that. Now let's look at one of these 5-7 chords. We'll take E7 since we started with that. Look at the notes. Specifically, look at the interval between the 3rd and the 7th of the chord. That is a tritone. It's spelled as a diminished fifth. Let's do this. Let's invert it. I'll move the G sharp up an octave. Now it's written as an augmented fourth, but let's respell it as a diminished fifth. To do that, we'll just rewrite the G sharp as A flat. Now remember how I said that tritones are unique in that they invert to themselves? I just inverted this tritone and ended up with a tritone. It's the same pitches, I've just spelled it differently on paper, right? Now we know that the 3rd and the 7th of a 5-7 chord form a tritone. So that means we can just fill in the root and the fifth. What do we end up with? B flat 7. So I took E7, I only kept the notes in the chord that form a tritone, I spelled them differently, and I filled the notes back in, and ended up with B flat 7. Okay, so what's the epiphany here? E7 and B flat 7 share 2 common pitches. They share the same tritone interval. Also notice how the note B flat is a tritone away from E. Because the same pair of pitches is present in both chords, you could argue that you could swap one for the other, because the tritone is at the center of how a dominant 7th chord functions. This is tritone substitution. Hold that thought. You may have figured out where we're going by now, but let's look at our falling fifth progression again. I'm going to omit the fifth from every chord because it doesn't tell us anything and we don't need it. Here we have E7 to A7 to D7 to G7 to C major 7 for some flavor. Notice how the top pairs of notes are descending chromatically 1 fret at a time. Those are the tritones in each of these chords. So what happens if we apply tritone substitution to one of these chords? We'll do it to the A7. We end up with E flat 7, which shares the same tritone as A7. Let's substitute the G7 as well, and we will get D flat 7. And now look at that. We have 4 dominant 7th chords in a row descending chromatically in strict parallel motion. And it is completely justified. The only thing left to do now is resolve that D flat 7 properly, and that would naturally go to some kind of G flat, so we'll make it G flat major 7. You can technically string together as many chromatically descending seventh chords like this as you want, or you can make a falling fifth progression go as long as you want. But there is a point where it becomes distasteful or the musical effect becomes stale. Use at your own discretion. So that's how tritone substitution works. I think it's really cool, and I think the math behind why it works is really satisfying. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. I hope I explained that well, and I hope you got something out of it. I put out a new video every Thursday, so I will see you next week. Peace.